We want to just keep pushing forward here on the show because we are very, very honored to have with us the musician and journalist Lowkey. Lowkey, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, it's really an honor to have you, and thanks for sticking with us. And maybe let's start first and foremost with some of what's been happening in Britain. Of course, we've had historic demonstrations, 1 million people recently out on the streets of London, and of course, the government attacking those demonstrations. The Home Secretary, who is at the forefront of trying to demonize them, has now been sacked. Obviously, there is a failed vote for a ceasefire yesterday, but nonetheless, we can see things that are happening. So talk about the significance of what we're seeing there in Britain and in the United Kingdom in terms of people rising in solidarity with Palestine.
I think, unfortunately, the last 3 decades has seen an integration of British intelligence with Israeli intelligence in an unprecedented way. You are talking about essentially a trilateral security state which rules the society, which is made up of the British establishment, the US military establishment, and increasingly Israeli surveillance proxies, really, of Unit 8200 in Israel's military intelligence. It's the surveillance unit which spies on Palestinian communications and blackmails Palestinians with that information. It's been able to insinuate itself in the infrastructure of different countries, and Britain has been one of them. So, for instance, our police hack phones using Celebrite, which is an Israeli company founded by alumni of Unit 8200. You also have the police relying on NICE Systems, which is a subsidiary of Elbit Systems, for its investigations. When you look at the British political elite, there are strong signs of it being compromised in many different ways. Suella Braverman was one example, the former Home Secretary who recently was pushed out. She has gone on record as saying that she has close relatives who currently serve in the Israeli military. When it comes to Rishi Sunak, for example, the Prime Minister, this is somebody who his family business, Infosys, which was founded by his father-in-law, and which his wife has £500 million worth of shares in, actually formerly had a director, Yuri Levine, who came out of Unit 8200 in the Israeli military also. And of course, Infosys has 200 employees in the political entity of Israel. And it signed a memorandum of understanding with Israel in 2012 that it would deepen cooperation. So really, when you talk about Britain, you're talking about a state that, on top of this, it has something called the UK-Israel Tech Hub, which, get this, it's housed in the British Embassy in the entity of Israel. It's funded by the British government, and it is staffed by former Israeli military and intelligence personnel, and it exists for the purpose of procuring public sector contracts in Britain for Israeli tech companies. So get that. That's funded by the British taxpayer. So there is really a myriad of ways in which Britain is integrated with the Israeli intelligence elite. And unfortunately, it will take a lot more than hundreds of thousands of people on the street to break those chains.
Lowkey, you really start to wonder, what is the threshold? That was a question I kept asking myself the first couple of days after this started, was, okay, what's the threshold going to be? Is it going to be 500 dead children? It wasn't. It wasn't 1,000. It wasn't 2,000. I mean, we're saying we're now at 4,000, but there hasn't been any ongoing counting of the dead because the ability to even do that no longer exists in Gaza at the moment. So we actually don't know how many more thousands of people have actually been killed. But it does seem like there is some pressure that is having an outcome. You see the president of France calling for a ceasefire. You see Justin Trudeau, who I saw that you shared earlier today. He has called for it to stop. But he's also being prosecuted for basically being an accomplice to genocide, which is, I think, fantastic. So I guess for them, it's 4,000 dead children. But you start to wonder, what is it for the UK? What is it for the U.S. because you see all these reports, especially at least from the U.S. end of things, that the U.S. isn't happy with Israel attacking hospitals, but are just kind of shrugging their shoulders. I'm not sure I entirely buy that, but I'm just curious your thoughts about what is the threshold as we're just witnessing week after week of horror after hour of horrors and atrocities.
Well, I think that is the correct question at the beginning of any of Israel's military escapades, is to ask what is the threshold, because there were testimony given by anonymous actors within Israeli intelligence less than a year ago, where they stated exactly that at the beginning of every military adventure, there will be an exact number of dead people that they will stop at. Now, unfortunately, there have been those in this country who have an umbilical-like connection to the Israeli security establishment who have thrown around numbers like 40,000. Now, I'm not saying that to imply that that is what would happen. I'm saying that's the kind of numbers that people have been mentioning, and their justification for that kind of number is claiming that that is the number of active fighters in the Palestinian resistance faction that they claim to be targeting at this stage. So they say that is in consideration that that's the fighting force which is on the ground in Gaza, then that is an acceptable number to go for. Whether that is actually an indication of what is sustainable and is possible and will have international and even domestic consent to it is, I guess, another question, and something that all of us will have to work on pushing back against. But I do think with the Zionist movement, as it is a maximalist and fantastical movement, it seeks aims which seem to be far beyond its means. At the moment, we can say, and this was a leaked document that came from the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence, they see the idea of pushing 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza into the Sinai Desert as a possible scenario. They are trying to bribe Egypt into accepting those numbers. They have built up support in the US and in the European Union to actually foot the bill for that and to build a tent city that those people could be pushed into. And in order to achieve that, if you are the Israeli occupation forces within that tortured logic, they are clearly following a line to do that. And that is, you make the area as uninhabitable as possible. You attack all infrastructure that could provide ways for life to be sustained. You horrify people. You do. It's like the way that you could compel people to move out of a place. Israel is doing absolutely everything that would fit the bill for that. So while that is, it seems massively unrealistic, and in a hand-to-hand sense, on the street-to-street urban warfare sense, Israel is getting battered. The truth is that the Israeli military is used to attacking and bullying grandmas at checkpoints in Al Khalil in Hebron. It's used to dealing with unarmed teenagers in Al Quds. It's used to sniping civilians on the fence in the 2018 March of Return. It's used to using drones to bomb civilian targets. It's used to bombing people from F-16s and F-35s. It's not used to hand-to-hand combat on the streets. And we are seeing that play out. But, this is horrific, truly, truly horrific what Israel has exacted upon these people.
One element of this, of course, is the information war, the battle of ideas, the propaganda war that's being waged. And, here in the United States, there are a lot of, I think, progressive-leaning people who often look at, specifically BBC and The Guardian as being, more neutral, offering different views, being a place to look if you want to get outside the U.S. media bubble, which, of course, is 100% pro-Israel. So, I wonder if you could I mean, if you think that's true or where it is, because I do think that's a lot of people, here on this side of things, when they're thinking, how do I get another view? Those are two sources they go to. And on this issue, I wonder if that's a little bit of a fraught hope.
The truth is that Israel has launched a campaign to not only infiltrate but manipulate many of the channels which we receive our information from. You have examples at the BBC of somebody who was an IDF spokesman actually working as a producer at the BBC, simultaneous to having that job. You have the example of Mark Berg, who was a director of some of the BBC's flagship shows, go from working in that position to go and work at BICOM, Israel's largest lobby group in this country. He worked at BICOM for a few years and then went back to the BBC. You have that revolving door. But also, and this is another aspect of the story which I don't think is focused on enough, it was revealed that Proofpoint was responsible. It's a cybersecurity company. It was responsible for filtering the emails of both the Washington Post and CNN several years back during the Trump years. Now, what I found is that Proofpoint has in the last decade subsumed and absorbed 3 different organizations that were set up by veterans of Israeli military intelligence unit 8200, meaning that you have, for instance, the head of human resource at Proofpoint, and this is the company that filters the emails of Washington Post and CNN journalists, came directly from the Israeli Prime Minister's office. So we're now seeing organizations that actually, and one of them, the particular organization that was subsumed by Proofpoint, it has attended invitation-only conferences held by the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence. So what we're talking about are former Israeli intelligence people being involved in the filtering of the emails for some of the largest and most important news corporations and companies in the world. On top of that, you have a myriad of ways in which the Israeli embassy is able to apply pressure to news organizations. And hence you see some of these ridiculous passive voice headlines. You see, for example, the Associated Press consistently have backed up Israel's claims of the for example, in the 2022 case where they were fighting Jihad al-Islami in Gaza. It was obviously a far smaller campaign. There was a case of 4 or 5 Palestinian children visiting their grandparents' grave in a cemetery, and Israel bombed them, killing them. Now, not only did the Associated Press come out and back up the Israeli army's claim that it had been a misfired rocket from the Palestinian side, and then that later turned out to be false, but I found out the 3 journalists that wrote this article for the Associated Press also published their work with the Times of Israel and had a history of working for the Times of Israel. Times of Israel, of course, run by David Horowitz, not the David Horowitz in the US, a different David Horowitz, former Israeli soldier, owned by Seth Klarman, who funds the Democrats, who funds illegal Israeli settlements, and who funds various Islamophobic think tanks and pro-Israeli think tanks. And then they did the same thing this year with Al Ahli Hospital. You had a piece come out in the Associated Press, and the writers that wrote the piece also published their work with the Times of Israel. So there's very many ways in which Israel is able to have that sort of hegemony of information, but in a way social media has broken through it to some extent, and the power of the images that people are seeing are moving them on an emotional level to try and push back against some of this dominance. So in a way, it's harder than it was before for Israel to have control and monopoly on the narrative.
You know, Lowkey, you've been active on this issue for, I think, your entire career. You've been very outspoken on Palestine. And I'm just curious, having witnessed the response to one brutal massacre in Gaza after another over the last couple of decades, do you see something? Do you think this is a turning point? And I guess what I mean by that is in terms of public opinion. I mean, what you just described, right, is this well organized attempt to really like consolidate control over the way the media reports on this issue. And it's been really, really successful for as long as Israel's existed, really. It's only gotten more successful until recently, where it's not working anymore. And maybe a part of that social media, I think a part of it might also be how bad the propaganda is, especially like in recent days with these absurd videos by Israeli army spokespeople. I'm sure you've seen them. Just, Hamas is in this diaper and Hamas is in this baby bottle. And here's a calendar with every day of the week, Hamas. And people are just laughing at them. But do you think this is a turning point in terms of world opinion, particularly in the West?
Well, we are seeing Zionism, which is a top-heavy movement, which has always failed at winning hearts and minds, becoming less and less of a sustainable status quo. In order for you to maintain this unnatural social arrangement, you need fascistic cruelty on an industrial scale. And that violence is only going to get more and more pronounced and fascistic as time goes on. One of the manifestations of what you're talking about, which is that loss of international consent, is the Palestine Action Movement, which across the last 3 years in Britain has been relentlessly shutting down the arms sites of Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest arms manufacturer. And Palestine Action has succeeded in closing down permanently 2 sites of this arms company in Britain, even at the same time that the political sphere was more controlled by Israel than ever. Even in the constituency of the most pro-Israel leader that the Labour Party has ever had, Keir Starmer, even in his own constituency, the headquarters for Elbit Systems, which supplies 85% of the drones that the Israeli military use, this head office was shut down permanently by Palestine Action. Even in a community like Oldham, this factory had a subsidiary of Elbit Systems there, which was shut down thanks to the local community spreading information about what was going on inside the factory, going door to door and telling people about this company, and also setting up stalls in the local town centre. That, in tandem with Palestine Action organizing actions to shut down what was in the factories, you also saw the British Ministry of Defence cancel £280 million worth of contracts with Elbit Systems for the very reason that they stated of operational sovereignty being somehow weakened by working with Elbit Systems. All of that is thanks to the activity of Palestine Action. And essentially, Palestine Action is a channel for that energy which exists in the streets. As you've seen, there are hundreds of thousands of people in this country who ultimately feel very, very passionate about Palestinian liberation. However, they have been afflicted by a liberal misleadership which has viewed some comfortable choices for the establishment as a panacea. They have been told that, well, if you do this slightly inconveniencing thing for the government, then surely it will just lead to Palestinian liberation. And unfortunately, I think it also comes down to understanding that the means through which the Palestinians are able to defend themselves, and has been the case for at least the last 20 years, runs not only through Palestine, but through the south of Lebanon, but through Syria, but through Yemen, but through Iraq, and through Iran. This is a living, breathing machine which is resisting Israel and the United States across the region. And moreover, I think it's important to emphasize, while Palestinian armed resistance is designated as terrorism in Britain, in the United States, in the European Union, and in Japan, the rest of humanity are represented by governments that do not designate Palestinian armed resistance in the same way. Not only do you have UN Resolution 3246, which says any people that are exposed to foreign occupation have the right to resist through many means, including armed resistance. But also, we are literally talking about governments like the government of China, which represents 1.4 billion people, almost 20% of humanity. You're talking about even the government of Turkey, that represents about 80 million people, the government of Iran, the government of Pakistan, which represents hundreds of millions of people. You're talking about the government of Russia. These governments represent a larger section of humanity and do not designate these groups. So what you're seeing is the clashing between the old world and the new. The vast majority of humanity perceive themselves as post-colonial subjects who have emerged from colonialism, and they see themselves in the Palestinians.
Real quick before we let you go, where can people find your work?
You can see it on Twitter, on Instagram, or anywhere else.
Right on. Musician and journalist Lowkey, thank you so much for joining us here on The Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.